Greetings, friend, and welcome. So glad you could join us for Bedtime Biographies, where together we unwind and drift away to the soothing accounts of truly remarkable lives. Our journey this evening begins in the twilight of the 19th century. The air is thick with gas lamp smoke. Vienna waltzes through cobblestone streets, and a man with an impeccably trimmed beard sits in his study, listening intently as his patients speak of dreams, desires, and childhood memories they'd rather forget. His name, Sigmund Freud. His mission, to map the hidden continent of the human mind and prove that our deepest thoughts aren't quite our own. Before we properly begin Freud's story, just a brief thought. If these calm explorations of significant lives help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories. And we're always curious for your reflections. Let us know in the comments below what you think of Freud and which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime biography. Now, Freudian psychology gets thrown around a lot, sometimes as diagnosis, sometimes as parlor trick. But strip away the noise, and at its heart, it's really just a question. What if the reasons we do things aren't the reasons we think? What if beneath our polished conscious minds lurks a seething unconscious, filled with repressed desires, forgotten traumas, and wishes we'd never admit at dinner parties? Freud spent his life chasing that idea through scandal, censorship, and a truly staggering number of cigars. Of course, history took his theories and ran wild with them. Psychoanalysis, dream interpretation, theories about sexuality that made Victorian society clutch its pearls. But tonight, we're not here for the controversy. We're just here to meet the man behind the couch, a brilliant, stubborn, deeply complex thinker who wanted to understand why we suffer. And now, as the day winds down, let's begin to trace the life and times of this deeply influential mind explorer. This is the bedtime biography of Sigmund Freud. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Would Map the Mind. The story begins in 1856 in the small Moravian town of Freiburg, now part of the Czech Republic. A place where church bells marked the hours and the railway had only recently arrived, bringing with it whispers of a wider world. Here, in a modest apartment above a blacksmith's shop, a boy named Sigismund Shlomo Freud took his first breaths. His father, Jacob, was a wool merchant with gentle eyes and diminishing prospects. His mother, Amelie, was just 21, vivacious, ambitious, and utterly convinced her firstborn son was destined for greatness. Young Sigmund, as he'd later call himself, would inherit that conviction along with something far more useful, an insatiable curiosity about what made people tick. The Freud household was complicated in ways that would later fascinate psychoanalysts. Jacob had 2 grown sons from a previous marriage, one roughly Amelie's age. Little Sigmund grew up in a tangle of half-brothers, a doting mother who called him her golden Siggy, and a father whose authority seemed perpetually undermined by financial failures. By the time he was 4, the family had moved to Vienna, driven by Jacob's bankruptcy. They settled in the Leopoldstadt district, Vienna's Jewish quarter, where laundry hung between buildings and the smell of cabbage soup mingled with Yiddish prayers. The apartment was cramped, at one point 8 people sharing 4 rooms. But Amelie made sure Sigmund had the best space. She gave him his own room, with an oil lamp for studying, while the rest of the family made do with candles. At school, young Freud devoured everything: Greek, Latin, philosophy, and later Darwin's revolutionary ideas about evolution. His teachers noted 2 things. First, that the boy possessed an almost frightening ability to memorize entire passages after a single reading. And second, that he seemed particularly interested in the hidden meanings behind myths and stories. At the Sperl Gymnasium, he stood at the top of his class for 6 consecutive years, earning his father's rare praise and his mother's predictable adoration. By 17, Freud penned his graduation essay with characteristic ambition, a meditation on career choice that suggested his real calling was understanding human nature itself. His headmaster wrote that while the student showed exceptional promise, he possessed an overabundance of intellectual curiosity that may prove difficult to channel. Meanwhile, Vienna whispered its own contradictions. The Habsburg Empire was crumbling elegantly, holding together through waltzes and architectural grandeur while nationalism festered beneath. Freud, as a Jew in an increasingly anti-Semitic culture, learned early that surfaces rarely told the whole story. He'd spend his life peeling back those surfaces, though he couldn't have known it yet. For now, he was simply a brilliant young man with dark, penetrating eyes and a restlessness that no amount of soccer tort could satisfy. His mother dreamed he'd become a great general or minister. His father hoped he'd become respectable and solvent. But the boy who'd grown up in cramped rooms, listening to adults speak in riddles and watching his father's quiet humiliations, was already asking questions too uncomfortable for polite society. In 1873, he enrolled at the University of Vienna, carrying a stack of books, a head full of ambitions, and a mind primed to revolutionize how we understand ourselves. The narrow streets of Leopoldstadt would see him occasionally after that, the prodigal son returning between breakthroughs, each time a little more convinced that the mind's darkest corners held the keys to human suffering. Chapter 2: The Cocaine Incident and Other Youthful Enthusiasms. University life arrived like a revelation, though not always in expected ways. The University of Vienna in 1873 was all marble staircases and ancient traditions, a far cry from the cramped Jewish quarter where Freud had grown up. The 17-year-old student dove in head first, initially planning to study law before a lecture on Goethe's essay Nature stirred something deeper. Medicine, he decided, would be his path to understanding the human animal. But Freud was easily distracted by fascination. He spent his first years dissecting eels in a research station, trying to locate their elusive reproductive organs. 400 eel dissections later, he still hadn't found their testes, a somewhat on-the-nose metaphor for his early career. His supervisor noted that while the young man showed exceptional attention to detail, he seemed more interested in the mystery than the answer. By 1876, Freud had transferred to Ernst Brücke's Physiological Institute, trading eels for the revolutionary idea that the nervous system operated according to physical laws, not spiritual forces. Brücke became a father figure, stern, exacting, and committed to materialist science. Under his tutelage, Freud learned to look for physical explanations for psychological phenomena, though he'd eventually flip that equation on its head. The transformation was gradual. The medical student who'd arrived with dreams of pure research now spent nights in Viennese coffee houses, smoking too many cigarettes and debating philosophy with fellow students. His letters to his friend Eduard Zilberstein were filled with elaborate fantasies, private jokes in Spanish, and increasingly ambitious theories about consciousness. Then came the cocaine episode, Freud's most embarrassing detour. In 1884, reading about the newly isolated compound, he became convinced it was a miracle drug. He took it himself, noting the euphoria and increased focus. He prescribed it to patients. He even sent some to his fiancée, Martha Bernays, with a note suggesting it would make her strong and give her cheeks a red color. He published Über Coca, enthusiastically promoting its benefits for everything from depression to indigestion. What could possibly go wrong? Everything, as it turned out. His friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxau, whom Freud had encouraged to use cocaine to overcome morphine addiction, became hopelessly dependent on both substances. The medical community quickly recognized cocaine's addictive properties, and Freud found himself publicly embarrassed. He'd later try to downplay this episode, though his detractors would gleefully remind him of it for decades. By 1881, Freud had finally earned his medical degree, 8 years after starting, having spent most of his time in research rather than clinical training. At 25, the newly minted Dr. Freud imagined a comfortable career in neurology, mapping brain lesions and publishing respectable papers. But Vienna's medical establishment had other ideas. As a Jew without family connections or money, academic positions remained frustratingly out of reach. And so the young doctor stepped onto a different path, one that led not to university laboratories, but to the peculiar world of neurotic patients, hysterical symptoms, and eventually the darkest recesses of the human psyche. But that journey would have to wait. For now, Freud left his student years with a medical degree he wasn't sure how to use. Theories too radical for Vienna's medical establishment, and a lingering embarrassment over that cocaine business. The promising student was about to become a struggling doctor. The hangovers from bad wine would continue, but now they'd be accompanied by something far more potent. A growing obsession with the mysteries hidden in his patients' strange symptoms and stranger dreams. Chapter 3. The Talking Cure. The struggling neurologist found his first real puzzle not in a laboratory, but in the consulting room of an older colleague. Vienna, 1882. Freud, now 26 and desperately needing to establish a practice so he could marry his beloved Martha, took a position at Vienna General Hospital. It was there, wandering between wards filled with soldiers' head wounds and women's hysterical paralyses, that he encountered something that would change everything. Joseph Breuer, a respected physician 14 years Freud's senior, shared a curious case over coffee one afternoon. A patient he called Anna O., actually a brilliant young woman named Bertha Pappenheim, had developed the most baffling symptoms: paralysis, vision disturbances, an inability to drink water despite being desperately thirsty, and perhaps strangest of all, she could only speak in English, having somehow forgotten her native German. But here was the remarkable part. When Breuer sat with Anna and let her talk through the memories associated with each symptom, really talk, sometimes for hours, the symptoms would vanish. She called it her talking cure, and Breuer was astounded. No hypnosis, no medication, just conversation somehow unlocking what conventional medicine couldn't touch. Freud listened with growing excitement. The medical establishment treated hysteria as either malingering or a wandering womb. Yes, really. But here was evidence that psychological suffering had psychological causes and potentially psychological cures. He began applying Breuer's method to his own patients at the hospital, though his superiors looked on with skepticism bordering on disdain. In 1885, Freud won a traveling fellowship to study in Paris with Jean-Martin Charcot, the neurologist who'd made hysteria scientifically respectable by demonstrating it in dramatic Tuesday lectures at the Salpêtrière Hospital. Charcot's performances were legendary. He'd hypnotize hysterical women, make their symptoms appear and disappear like a stage magician, all while audiences of doctors and socialites watched in fascination. For 4 months, Freud absorbed everything. Charcot's central insight was revolutionary. If symptoms could be induced through suggestion, then perhaps all hysterical symptoms were psychological rather than neurological. Freud watched transfixed as the great man demonstrated that ideas could cause physical paralysis. The implications were staggering. Returning to Vienna in 1886, newly married to Martha and desperately needing income, Freud opened his private practice at Rathausstrasse 7. The rooms were modest but respectable, filled with ancient artifacts he'd begun collecting, and a couch he'd inherited from a grateful patient. That couch would become more famous than most furniture has any right to be. His early patients were Vienna's nervous bourgeoisie, women with mysterious pains, men with inexplicable tics, the walking wounded of a society that demanded perfect propriety while generating impossible pressures. Freud tried Charcot's hypnosis, but found himself frustrated. Some patients couldn't be hypnotized. Others seemed to improve temporarily, only to relapse. Then came the breakthrough, almost by accident. One patient, annoyed at his attempts to hypnotize her, snapped, "Doctor, if you just let me talk, I could tell you what's wrong." And so he did. He let her talk. And as she talked about her childhood, her fears, her anger at her father, connections emerged. The symptom, she realized mid-sentence, had begun right after a specific traumatic incident she'd forgotten until that moment. Freud scribbled notes furiously. What if symptoms were like symbols? What if the body was expressing what the mind couldn't say? By 1895, he and Breuer published Studies on Hysteria, their collaborative exploration of these ideas. The book included case studies written with the psychological insight of literature. Emmy von N., Lucy R., and others whose suffering Freud treated with something approaching empathy unusual for the time. But collaboration with Breuer was already straining. Freud was pushing toward uncomfortable conclusions about sexual trauma that made his older colleague nervous. The talking cure was opening doors Viennese society preferred to keep locked. As winter settled over Vienna, Freud refined his technique. He moved from hypnosis to simple conversation, encouraging patients to say whatever came to mind without censorship. The beginning of what he'd call free association. The respectable doctor had stumbled onto something dangerous, a method for accessing hidden thoughts, forbidden desires, and memories so painful they'd been banished from consciousness. He didn't know it yet, but he was developing the basic tools of psychoanalysis. That strange practice where two people sit in a room, one talking, one listening, both trying to make sense of the chaos inside a single human mind. The neurologist who'd spent his youth dissecting eels and snorting cocaine was about to become something Vienna had never seen, an archaeologist of the psyche, excavating buried memories from the ruins of his patient's symptoms. Chapter 4. The Dream Detective. The encounter that would define Freud's legacy happened in the most mundane way possible. He started paying attention to his own dreams. Vienna, July 1895. Freud, now 39, was spending a summer evening at the Bellevue restaurant on a hill overlooking the city. He'd been treating a patient named Irma, and the case wasn't going well. That night, he dreamed of examining her throat, other doctors appearing, ridiculous diagnoses being offered, the whole thing absurd and anxiety-producing. But when he woke and began analyzing the dream with his new technique, free associating to each element, something astonishing emerged. The dream wasn't random nonsense. It was a brilliant piece of mental theater, constructed to absolve him of guilt about Irma's treatment, while simultaneously expressing his anxiety about it. Every element meant something, and the contradictions were the point. The dream was doing psychological work, protecting his sleep while processing his worries. By autumn, Freud was obsessed. He began recording his own dreams in a notebook, subjecting them to the same ruthless analysis he applied to his patients. The dreams were bizarre. His father dying, but also not dying. Being naked in public, but no one noticing. Rooms that morphed into other rooms. Yet, beneath the surrealism, patterns emerged. Dreams seemed to be wish fulfillments, however disguised. They used symbols, condensed multiple thoughts into single images, displaced emotion from one object to another. His friend Wilhelm Fliess became his sounding board and confidant. Fliess was an ear, nose, and throat specialist in Berlin with his own eccentric theories about nasal cycles and biorhythms, but he listened with enthusiasm as Freud shared his dream discoveries. Their correspondence became Freud's laboratory. Hundreds of letters where he worked out his ideas, admitted doubts, and shared dreams he couldn't tell anyone else about. The dreams revealed uncomfortable truths. Freud discovered his own hostility toward his father, his competitive feelings toward colleagues, his barely suppressed sexual attractions. If he was going to claim dreams revealed hidden wishes, he'd have to acknowledge his own hidden wishes were pretty unflattering. The self-analysis was brutal, like performing surgery on yourself without anesthesia. By 1897, Freud was writing what would become the interpretation of dreams, though he had no idea it would become his masterpiece. The writing sessions stretched deep into the night in his cramped study, surrounded by his growing collection of ancient figurines, Egyptian gods, Greek idols, primitive totems. Martha, patient as ever, would leave coffee outside his door and remind him to sleep. The book was unlike anything in medical literature. Part scientific treatise, part memoir, part detective story. Freud used his own dreams as primary evidence, walking readers through the hidden meanings behind seemingly nonsensical images. The Irma's injection dream got its own chapter, analyzed in such intimate detail that readers could follow his thoughts branching like a root system into childhood memories, professional anxieties, and suppressed desires. But the book's truly radical claim came in its opening chapters. Dreams were the royal road to the unconscious. They proved that beneath our conscious minds operated an entirely different mental system, one that followed its own logic, knew no morality, acknowledged no impossibility, and worked tirelessly to protect our sleep while expressing forbidden wishes. The unconscious wasn't just some vague poetic concept. It was a discoverable territory with its own laws and language. When The Interpretation of Dreams, finally published in November 1899, though dated 1900 to make it seem more forward-looking, the silence was crushing. The first printing of 600 copies took 8 years to sell out. Reviews ranged from dismissive to hostile. One psychiatrist called it a scientific fairy tale. Another suggested Freud himself might need treatment. Yet, slowly, improbably, it found its readers. Young doctors fascinated by the mind's mysteries. Writers who recognized Freud's insights about symbolism. Ordinary people who'd never found their own strange dreams taken seriously before. The book that Vienna's medical establishment ignored would eventually sell millions of copies and reshape how humanity thought about thinking itself. In 1900, standing on the Bellevue Hill where the Irma dream had occurred, Freud allowed himself a moment of prophecy. "Do you suppose," he wrote to Fliess, "that someday one will read on a marble tablet on this house? Here, on July 24, 1895, the secret of dreams revealed itself to Dr. Sigmund Freud." The dream detective had cracked his first case, but the mystery of the human mind was just beginning to unfold, one unconscious revelation at a time. Chapter 5: The Oedipus Complex, or How Freud Made Thanksgiving Dinner Awkward Forever. The theory that would make Freud infamous and make millions of people side-eye their relationships with their parents emerged from his most painful self-analysis. Vienna, October 1897. Freud, deep in the throes of examining his own psyche, encountered a memory that disturbed him profoundly. Sexual feelings toward his mother, hostile wishes toward his father. His first instinct was to dismiss these as his own neurotic peculiarities. But then he noticed the same patterns in his patients. Over and over, in their free associations and dream analyses, emerged complicated feelings about parents, desire mixed with guilt, love tangled with aggression, all repressed and festering in the unconscious. At first, Freud believed his patients were recounting real seductions by adults, but something didn't add up. The sheer number of cases suggested an epidemic of abuse that seemed statistically impossible. In September 1897, he wrote to Flies with a confession that would prove pivotal. He no longer believed all his patients' stories of childhood seduction were literally true. This remains one of Freud's most controversial decisions. Some were undoubtedly real traumas, but others, he concluded, were fantasies, not lies, but imaginative elaborations of forbidden childhood wishes. This led to his most audacious theory. Children weren't innocent angels, but sexual beings. He'd eventually clarify he meant psychosexual, not adult sexuality, but the damage was done. Around age 3 to 5, little boys develop an erotic attachment to their mothers and see their fathers as rivals. Little girls experience the analogous situation. These weren't conscious thoughts, but primitive wishes arising from the unconscious. He called it the Oedipus Complex, named after Sophocles' tragic king who unknowingly killed his father and married his mother. Freud's insight was that Oedipus's story resonated across millennia precisely because it expressed universal unconscious wishes. We're all horrified by Oedipus's fate because we all harbor similar forbidden desires in our psychic basements. The implications were staggering and deeply uncomfortable. Normal psychological development required resolving these inappropriate attractions, typically by identifying with the same-sex parent and redirecting erotic feelings toward appropriate partners. Fail to resolve it, and you'd end up neurotic, stuck in childhood patterns, unconsciously seeking your mother or father in every romantic partner. When Freud presented these ideas at the Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, founded in 1902, initially just 4 colleagues meeting Wednesday nights in his waiting room, the reactions ranged from fascination to horror. One member resigned on the spot. Another accused Freud of projecting his own perversions onto humanity. Even supporters wondered if perhaps he'd gone too far. Vienna society was scandalized. The notion that proper bourgeois children harbored incestuous wishes was bad enough. But Freud kept pushing, arguing that adult neuroses were failed attempts to repress these childhood conflicts. That executive's mysterious paralysis? An unconscious punishment for masturbating as a child. That society lady's headaches? Converted sexual energy from forbidden desires. Everything traced back to sex, and specifically infantile sexuality. His most loyal supporters wrestled with these ideas. Alfred Adler, part of the early Wednesday Society, began developing his own theories, emphasizing power rather than sex. Carl Jung, the brilliant Swiss psychiatrist who'd become Freud's crown prince, had reservations about the universal applicability of the Oedipus Complex. These theoretical disagreements would eventually explode into bitter personal feuds. By 1905, Freud published 3 essays on the theory of sexuality, systematically laying out his theories of psychosexual development: oral, anal, phallic stages, each with its own conflicts and potential pathologies. The book was condemned as pornographic by many reviewers. One called it a parade of pure filth. Universities refused to stock it. Yet it sold steadily, particularly among the young and intellectually curious. The irony wasn't lost on observers. Freud himself was notably prudish. He dressed conservatively, maintained a formal bourgeois household, and his own marriage was reportedly platonic after Martha bore their 6 children. This man, making sex the center of mental life, seemed personally uncomfortable with actual sexuality, leading some to wonder if his theories said more about his own repressions than universal truth. Still, the Oedipus Complex became psychoanalysis's foundation. Therapy sessions now focused on excavating childhood relationships with parents. Patients learned to interpret their life patterns as repetitions of unresolved family dynamics. The whole enterprise of understanding yourself became, in effect, understanding what happened between you and your parents decades ago. Today, few therapists accept the Oedipus Complex in its original form. But Freud's core insight, that early relationships with caregivers shape adult patterns, that we unconsciously repeat childhood dynamics, that family influences run deeper than we acknowledge. These ideas have become so embedded in Western thinking, we barely notice them. The doctor who'd started by treating hysterical symptoms had become something far more unsettling, a prophet of the family romance, insisting that our most private feelings toward our parents were the script for everything that followed. Thanksgiving dinners would never be quite the same. Chapter 6: The Wednesday Night Fight Club. Vienna's medical establishment had mostly written Freud off as an eccentric when something unexpected happened. Followers began to appear. It started in autumn 1902 when Freud invited 4 colleagues to meet at his apartment on Wednesday evenings. Wilhelm Steckel, a young physician with his own neurotic symptoms. Max Kahan, a general practitioner curious about the new methods. Rudolf Reitler, a colleague from the hospital. And Alfred Adler, a brilliant but prickly socialist doctor from the working-class district. They'd gather in Freud's waiting room at Berggasse 19, surrounded by his artifacts. Egyptian figurines, seeming to watch the proceedings like ancient judges. Martha would serve black coffee and small cakes before tactfully withdrawing. Then the meetings would begin, thick with cigar smoke and thicker with theoretical debate. One member would present a case or theoretical paper, and Freud would preside like a benevolent dictator, offering interpretation and, increasingly, doctrine. The Vienna Psychoanalytic Society, as it would become known, operated with cult-like devotion and academic rigor in equal measure. Freud was the professor, his word carrying enormous weight. When he endorsed an idea, it became orthodoxy. When he rejected one, its proponent often found themselves on thin ice. The meetings ran late into the night, arguments about penis envy and death drives echoing through the respectable apartment building. By 1906, interest was spreading beyond Vienna. A young Swiss psychiatrist named Carl Jung sent Freud a copy of his word association studies, and Freud recognized a brilliant mind, and, perhaps more importantly, a non-Jewish Gentile who could give psychoanalysis respectability beyond its largely Jewish Viennese circle. Their correspondence began warmly, Jung addressing Freud almost as a father figure, Freud responding with unusual emotional openness. But tensions simmered from the start. Jung had reservations about Freud's sexual theories, particularly the universality of the Oedipus Complex. He was interested in mythology and mysticism in ways that made the materialist Freud uncomfortable. And Jung, directing the prestigious Bergholzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, had career prospects and institutional standing that Freud had never achieved. The Wednesday meetings became increasingly contentious. Adler, uncomfortable with Freud's emphasis on sexuality, began developing his own theories about the inferiority complex and will to power. Wilhelm Stekel, though devoted to Freud, kept introducing modifications to theory that irritated the master. By 1910, tensions boiled over at the Nuremberg Congress, where Freud tried to install Jung as the president for life of the international psychoanalytic movement. The Viennese disciples felt betrayed. Adler complained bitterly about being subordinated to a Swiss newcomer. The meetings became less collegial, more combative. Freud, sensing rebellion, demanded absolute loyalty to core psychoanalytic principles. Those who deviated weren't just wrong, they were resistors, suffering from their own unconscious complexes that prevented them from seeing the truth. In 1911, Adler officially broke away, taking several members with him to form his own school of individual psychology. Freud declared him a heretic and forbade any remaining society members from attending Adler's lectures. The split was bitter and personal. Two men who'd met weekly for nearly a decade, now crossing the street to avoid each other. Stekel departed in 1912 after a vicious argument about editing the journal Freud controlled. Jung's relationship with Freud, meanwhile, was deteriorating into mutual accusations of father complex, Jung, and inability to accept authority, also Jung, according to Freud. Their final break came in 1913, ending not just a professional collaboration, but what had been, for both men, the most emotionally intense relationship of their lives. The pattern would repeat throughout Freud's career. Brilliant disciples, intense idealization, theoretical disagreement, bitter schism. Otto Rank, Sandor Ferenczi, even his own daughter Anna, would later have periods of tension, though Anna, perhaps wisely, never fully broke away. Each split left Freud wounded, but more convinced of his theory's rightness. If these brilliant men couldn't accept his ideas, it must be because their own neuroses prevented them from seeing the unconscious truth. The psychoanalytic movement Freud built resembled less a scientific society than a religious order, complete with apostles, heretics, and occasional excommunications. The Wednesday night gatherings that had begun as collaborative explorations of the mind had become ideological battlegrounds where loyalty mattered as much as insight. Yet from this contentious crucible emerged a truly global movement. By 1914, there were psychoanalytic societies in Vienna, Zurich, Berlin, London, and New York. Freud's ideas, however disputed, had spread far beyond that cigar-choked waiting room in Vienna. The Fight Club had gone international, and the fights were only getting started. Chapter 7: The Great War and Its Discontents. The guns of August 1914 shattered more than Europe's peace. They shattered Freud's worldview. Vienna erupted in patriotic fervor as the Austro-Hungarian Empire marched toward catastrophe. Crowds cheered in the streets. Young men enlisted with flowers in their rifle barrels. And Freud, age 58, found himself caught in an unexpected emotion: enthusiasm. "All my libido is given to Austro-Hungary," he wrote with shocking earnestness to his colleague Karl Abraham. For a few heady weeks, the doctor who'd spent decades analyzing humanity's irrationality succumbed to the same nationalist intoxication as his neighbors. He imagined the war would be brief and glorious, a cleansing storm that would revitalize stagnant European culture. Reality arrived with the casualty lists. Freud's sons, Martin and Ernst, both enlisted. He spent agonizing nights listening for the mail, dreading the telegram that might announce a death. His practice evaporated as Vienna's wealthy fled or went bankrupt. The scientific journals stopped publishing. International correspondence became impossible. The psychoanalytic movement, barely established, found itself divided by trenches and barbed wire. But the war brought Freud something unexpected: new patients. Soldiers began returning from the front with mysterious symptoms that looked remarkably like the hysteria he'd observed in women. Shell shock, they called it. Men who'd been buried alive in collapsed trenches, who'd seen their comrades blown apart, who'd spent months in the mechanized slaughter of industrialized warfare. They returned paralyzed, mute, trembling uncontrollably, unable to sleep without nightmares. The military psychiatrists treated these symptoms as cowardice or malingering. The standard treatment was essentially torture: electric shocks applied to the affected body parts until the soldier, desperate to escape the pain, recovered his function. It was psychiatry as punishment, and Freud found it morally revolting. He began treating shell-shocked soldiers who made it to his practice, and what he found challenged his theories. These men's symptoms weren't from repressed sexual wishes or Oedipal conflicts. They were traumatized, a word that wasn't quite in the psychiatric vocabulary yet. They compulsively relived their traumas in nightmares and flashbacks, experiences that seemed to contradict Freud's pleasure principle. Why would the psyche force someone to relive unbearable experiences? Out of this dark period emerged Beyond the Pleasure Principle, 1920, perhaps Freud's strangest and most speculative work. He proposed the existence of a death drive, thanatos, a fundamental instinct toward destruction and return to an inorganic state. It operated alongside eros, the life drive, and their eternal conflict explained both human creativity and human cruelty. War, he realized, wasn't an aberration of civilization, but an expression of something deep in human nature. The theory divided his followers. Some saw profound insight into human destructiveness. Others thought the professor had finally lost it, veering into philosophical speculation unsuitable for science. Even Freud seemed uncertain, admitting the ideas were often far-fetched. By war's end in 1918, Vienna was collapsing. The empire had shattered into fragments. Inflation was spiraling out of control. A loaf of bread cost what a house had cost before the war. Freud's savings evaporated. He could only see patients who paid in hard currency, meaning mostly Americans. His youngest daughter, Sophie, died in the 1918 flu pandemic, sending him into profound grief. Yet from this devastation came his most accessible book, Civilization and Its Discontents, 1930. A meditation on why humans create societies that make them miserable. Civilization, Freud argued, requires repressing our aggressive and sexual instincts, creating an internal police force, the superego, that torments us with guilt. We trade freedom and satisfaction for security and order, and the deal leaves everyone unhappy. The book was bleak, brilliant, and spoke directly to a generation disillusioned by progress. The war had transformed Freud's thinking. The optimistic scientist who'd believed psychoanalysis could cure neuroses had become a pessimistic philosopher convinced that human destructiveness was ineradicable. He'd started his career asking, "Why do people suffer?" He was ending it asking, "Why are people so eager to make each other suffer?" The trenches of World War I hadn't just killed millions, they'd killed Freud's faith in rationality and progress. The man who discovered the unconscious now believed its darkest impulses might ultimately prevail. It was a grim conclusion from a man who'd spent his life trying to bring light to mental darkness. As Vienna slowly rebuilt itself in the 1920s, Freud sat in his study, surrounded by artifacts of dead civilizations, and wondered if ours might be next. Chapter 8. The Cocaine Years Redux, or That Cigar Might Kill You. The diagnosis came in April 1923, discovered almost accidentally. Freud noticed a lesion in his mouth. Nothing alarming, just an irritation from his endless cigar smoking. His personal physician, Felix Deutsch, examined it and immediately paled. It was cancer and already advanced. The doctor faced an ethical nightmare: tell Freud the truth or spare him the knowledge. Deutsch chose to lie, calling it a benign growth. It was a decision he'd regret for the rest of his life. Freud, the man who'd built his career on uncomfortable truths, wouldn't learn the full diagnosis for months. By then, the first of what would eventually be 33 surgeries had already been performed. A crude operation that removed part of his jaw and palate, leaving him disfigured and in constant pain. The cause was unmistakable: cigars. Freud smoked 20 a day, had since his 20s, and despite repeated urgings from colleagues and family, couldn't stop. I owe to the cigar a great intensification of my capacity to work and a facilitation of my self-control, he'd written years earlier. Now he owed it a cancerous jaw and 16 years of agony. The prosthetic device, a crude metal and rubber contraption called the monster, had to be inserted each morning to separate his nasal cavity from his mouth. Speaking became difficult, eating torture. His once clear diction dissolved into muffled sounds that patients strained to understand. Yet Freud continued seeing patients, adjusting the monster between sessions, refusing to let physical suffering interrupt his work. His daughter Anna became his primary caretaker, a role that would define the rest of her life. She accompanied him to surgeries, managed his pain, and gradually became his professional heir, the only one of his 6 children to follow him into psychoanalysis. Their relationship was complex, layered with the very dynamics Freud had theorized about. Anna never married, devoting herself instead to her father and his work, a decision that would spark endless speculation among later analysts. The cancer turned Freud into something he'd never been: stoic. He refused pain medication stronger than aspirin, claiming he needed his mind clear for thinking. He continued writing, his output barely diminishing even as his physical condition deteriorated. Inhibitions, Symptoms, and Anxiety appeared in 1926, a major revision of his anxiety theory. The Future of an Illusion followed in 1927, a withering critique of religion that he'd been planning for decades. His colleagues watched in horrified admiration. Here was a man literally being eaten alive, who spent his mornings having his mouth irrigated of pus and dead tissue, yet still saw 8 patients a day and wrote theoretical papers in the evening. The discipline was either heroic or pathological, depending on who you asked. By the late 1920s, Freud was becoming a public figure despite his illness. Tourists would walk past Berggasse 19, hoping to catch a glimpse of the famous doctor. His books were translated into dozens of languages. The psychoanalytic movement had societies on every continent. Yet the man at the center seemed increasingly pessimistic about humanity's prospects. When the stock market crashed in 1929, sending the world into economic depression, Freud saw it as confirmation of his darker theories. Civilization's discontents were bubbling to the surface. Political extremism was rising across Europe. And still he smoked, despite the cancer, despite the pain, despite everyone begging him to stop. His physician, Hans Pichler, performed surgery after surgery, each time removing more tissue, each time offering diminishing hope. Freud approached these operations with the same analytical detachment he brought to dreams. "An interesting experience," he'd comment afterward, as if discussing someone else's trauma. The defense mechanisms he'd identified, denial, intellectualization, sublimation, were on full display in his own response to mortality. In 1930, he received the Goethe Prize, Frankfurt's highest cultural honor. Too ill to attend the ceremony, Anna read his acceptance speech, a meditation on Goethe's scientific writings that was really about how even the greatest minds must confront their limitations. The literary world celebrated him. The medical establishment remained mostly skeptical. Through it all, the consulting room at Berggasse 19 remained his sanctuary. The famous couch with its Persian rug and pillows, the artifacts crowding every surface, thousands of figurines, like a museum of dead civilizations surrounding the archaeologist of the living mind. Patients lay on the couch and spoke, while Freud sat behind them, mostly silent now, his ruined mouth making long interpretations impossible. What they couldn't see was a man in constant pain, adjusting an uncomfortable prosthetic, wrestling with the knowledge that every cigar he continued to smoke, and he never fully stopped, was hastening his death. The founder of psychoanalysis, who'd taught that understanding our self-destructive impulses could free us from them, couldn't free himself from his own. It was the ultimate clinical demonstration of a principle he'd articulated. Insight alone doesn't cure. Knowing why you do something and being able to stop are entirely different achievements. Freud knew exactly what was killing him. He continued smoking anyway, proof that even the unconscious's decoder couldn't fully escape its grip. Chapter 9. The Nazi Problem. The brown shirts began appearing on Vienna's streets in the early 1930s, their jackboots echoing off cobblestones with increasing frequency. Freud, now in his 70s and ravaged by cancer, watched the rise of Nazism with a mixture of horror and grim vindication. Hadn't he argued in Civilization and Its Discontents that humanity's aggressive drives were barely contained? Here was his death drive theory playing out in torchlight parades and beer hall putsches. By 1933, when Hitler seized power in Germany, the implications for psychoanalysis and for Jews became unmistakable. In Berlin, Nazi students made a bonfire of books they deemed degenerate. As Freud's works burned alongside those of Einstein, Mann, and Zweig, he supposedly remarked with dark humor, "What progress we are making! In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." The Viennese Psychoanalytic Society began hemorrhaging members. German analysts fled to London, Paris, America, anywhere away from the swastika. Freud's publishing house, the Internationaler Psychoanalytischer Verlag, collapsed as the German market vanished overnight. The international movement he'd built was scattering like seeds in a windstorm. Yet Freud refused to leave Vienna. This was his city, however ambivalent his relationship with it. He'd lived at Berggasse 19 since 1891, nearly 50 years. His practice, his artifacts, his routine, the structure that kept his disciplined mind working despite constant pain, all were here. Besides, he rationalized, Austria wasn't Germany. The Austrians wouldn't let things get that bad. His colleagues and family begged him to reconsider. Ernest Jones, his British lieutenant, offered to arrange everything for a move to London. Princess Marie Bonaparte, his wealthy French analysand, promised financial support. Even patients urged him to flee. But Freud was stubborn, convinced that at his age and condition, the Nazis wouldn't bother with him. The annexation of Austria in March 1938, the Anschluss, shattered that illusion. Within hours, Nazi troops were parading through Vienna to massive crowds, cheering Ein Volk, ein Reich, ein Führer. The very next day, stormtroopers appeared at Berggasse 19. They ransacked the apartment, terrorized Anna, and confiscated the Psychoanalytic Society's funds. Only Martha's legendary composure prevented worse. She offered the thugs money from a drawer, treating them like unwelcome but manageable guests. Anna was arrested by the Gestapo and held for a day of interrogation that left even Freud, who prized emotional control, shaking with fear. When she returned, released only because of frantic diplomatic intervention, Freud finally accepted reality. They had to leave, and immediately. What followed was a nightmare of bureaucratic extortion. The Nazis demanded enormous emigration taxes, essentially ransoms for being allowed to leave with your life. There were forms, permits, certifications, all requiring bribes. Princess Bonaparte paid most of it, liquidating assets to raise the necessary funds. The Gestapo inventoried every one of Freud's artifacts, assessing their value for confiscation. On June 4, 1938, after weeks of uncertainty, the Freuds boarded the Orient Express for Paris. Freud was 82, ravaged by cancer, barely able to speak through his deteriorating prosthetic. He carried what he could of his collection. The Nazis had allowed him to take some pieces, and left behind the city he'd called home for 78 years. The journey to London via Paris was exhausting. Crowds of supporters met him at stations along the way, eager to glimpse the famous psychoanalyst in exile. In Paris, Marie Bonaparte and William Bullitt, American ambassador to France, greeted him. British newspapers covered his arrival with unusual warmth. The great mind rescued from barbarism, a narrative that appealed to British self-image. The house at 20 Maresfield Gardens in Hampstead became his final home. It was spacious, well-appointed, nothing like the cramped Viennese apartment. His artifacts were unpacked and arranged around him, those ancient witnesses to human civilization that had survived so much longer than any individual life. The consulting room was recreated, the famous couch positioned just so. But Freud knew he'd never practice again. 4 of his elderly sisters remained in Vienna, unable to get exit visas. He'd tried everything to get them out, but bureaucracy and Nazi malice conspired against them. They would all die in concentration camps. Mitzi, Rosa, Dolphy, and Polly, murdered by the regime that had driven their famous brother into exile. The guilt tormented him more than the cancer. He'd escaped. They hadn't. The survivor's guilt Freud had theorized about was now his daily reality. Letters from colleagues reported the destruction of psychoanalysis in German-speaking Europe. Clinics closed, books burned, analysts arrested or fled. Everything he'd built over 4 decades was being systematically erased. In September 1938, barely 3 months after arriving in London, Freud wrote a bitter addendum to Moses and Monotheism, the book he'd been working on for years. "We live here in an atmosphere of tolerance and kindness," he noted, "but underneath there is a great sense of danger." Even in safety, he couldn't shake the feeling that civilization's veneer was fatally thin. The man who'd spent his career analyzing how individuals repress their destructive impulses had watched an entire nation surrender to those impulses. It was, in the most horrible way, the ultimate confirmation of his theories. And the confirmation brought him no satisfaction whatsoever. Chapter 10. 20 Maresfield Gardens. London greeted Freud with surprising warmth. The British, who'd once viewed psychoanalysis with characteristic skepticism, now embraced him as a symbol of enlightenment fleeing barbarism. Famous visitors arrived at Maresfield Gardens. H.G. Wells came to tea. Salvatore Dali sketched him, creating a surreal portrait that captured Freud's physical deterioration. And Stefan Zweig brought a young writer Freud had never heard of, but who was obsessed with psychoanalysis, a fellow Viennese refugee. But the visits couldn't disguise the reality. Freud was dying. The cancer had progressed beyond any hope of control. His jaw was largely destroyed, the prosthetic barely functional. Eating was agony, speaking nearly impossible. He spent his days in the garden when weather permitted, surrounded by flowers Martha tended with determined cheerfulness. Anna had become more than his caretaker. She was now the keeper of his legacy. She managed his correspondence, made decisions about visitors, and was already planning how to preserve his work and home for posterity. Their relationship had transcended normal family dynamics, becoming something psychoanalysis itself struggled to categorize. She was daughter, disciple, nurse, and eventually executor of not just his estate, but his entire intellectual heritage. The Hampstead house filled with familiar artifacts. Freud arranged his collection obsessively, each figurine in its place, the consulting room recreated as faithfully as possible. It was as if surrounding himself with these ancient objects could somehow anchor him against dissolution. The Egyptian Shabti figures, the Greek gods, the Asian deities, they'd outlasted empires and would outlast him too. His last months were spent finishing Moses and Monotheism, a peculiar book arguing that Moses was actually Egyptian, and that Judaism's most traumatic secret was the murder of this founding father. The theory was far-fetched, infuriating to Jewish scholars, and probably unprovable. But it mattered to Freud, perhaps because it let him wrestle with his own complicated Jewish identity, or perhaps because even dying, he couldn't resist one final provocation. By summer 1939, the pain had become unbearable. Morphine no longer touched it. Freud could barely sleep, couldn't eat, could manage only tiny sips of liquid. His physician, Max Schur, whom he'd made promise years earlier to help him die when the time came, watched his patients suffering with increasing distress. War was coming. Everyone knew it. Hitler had already taken Czechoslovakia. Poland would be next. The civilization Freud had analyzed so brilliantly was about to tear itself apart again, barely 2 decades after the last catastrophe. He wouldn't live to see this war, and perhaps that was mercy. On September 21, 1939, with France and Britain already at war with Germany for 3 weeks, Freud reminded Schur of his promise. "Now it's nothing but torture and makes no sense," he said in his halting, damaged speech. Schur understood. He administered morphine, a large dose, then another. Freud slipped into a coma and died on September 23rd, 3 weeks past his 83rd birthday. The death certificate listed cancer of the jaw as cause, but those present knew it was physician-assisted suicide, illegal in Britain then as now. Schur kept the secret for decades. It was, in its way, Freud's final act of self-determination, choosing death on his terms rather than submitting to meaningless suffering. The man who'd spent his life analyzing why people do things was coherent about why he chose his final act. His funeral was held at Golders Green Crematorium, a subdued affair given wartime restrictions. Ernest Jones delivered the eulogy, speaking of how Freud had opened up a realm of knowledge that had previously been hidden. Stefan Zweig read from Freud's letters. The ashes were placed in a Greek urn from his collection, one he'd particularly loved. A red figure bell crater from ancient Athens depicting Dionysian revelers. Appropriate somehow for the man who'd argued that beneath civilization's surface raged primitive impulses. Anna scattered some ashes in the crematorium's gardens. The rest remained in the urn at the house she would preserve as a museum. She'd spend the next 4 decades defending her father's legacy, analyzing children using his methods and ensuring that psychoanalysis survived the war that had driven them from Vienna. Back at Bergasse 19, now in Nazi-occupied Austria, a German family had moved into the apartment. Freud's consultation room served as someone's bedroom. The space where he'd listened to thousands of hours of confessions and dreams and analyzed the unconscious roots of human suffering was just another address in a conquered city. But the ideas that had been born in that room, they were already beyond any government's reach, scattered across the world in books, training analyses, therapeutic techniques, and the minds of thousands who'd been touched by psychoanalysis. The Nazis could burn Freud's books, occupy his apartment, and murder his sisters. They couldn't kill what he'd discovered about how minds work. As London endured the Blitz in the months after Freud's death, Anna continued his work, treating traumatized children in the very house where he died. The bombs fell. Civilization's discontents made horrifyingly literal in aerial warfare, and the daughter carried forward what the father had begun. The old man was gone, but the unconscious he'd mapped continued its work in every living mind, indifferent to death, warfare, or history's judgments. Chapter 11. The 50-Year Argument. The ink was barely dry on Freud's death certificate when the debates began. Debates that would continue for the rest of the century and beyond. Was psychoanalysis science or pseudoscience? Revolutionary insight or elaborate mythology? Freud's disciples split into factions before his ashes were cold, each claiming to represent authentic psychoanalysis while denouncing the others as heretics. Anna Freud in London emphasized ego psychology and child analysis, building on her father's later work. Melanie Klein, also in London but operating from a completely different framework, focused on the first year of life and primitive fantasies that would make even Freud uncomfortable. Their theoretical disputes played out in increasingly bitter confrontations in the British Psychoanalytic Society, with Klein's followers and Anna's loyalists barely able to occupy the same room. Across the Atlantic, American analysts were giving psychoanalysis a distinctly optimistic makeover. Heinz Hartmann developed ego psychology, emphasizing adaptation rather than conflict. The Americans loved it. Finally, a version of Freud that suggested people could be healthy, not just less neurotic. By the 1950s, psychoanalysis dominated American psychiatry, with analysts occupying every major department chair and training institutes producing hundreds of new practitioners. But this success came at a cost: dilution. American analysis became respectable, sanitized, and often bureaucratic. The wild insights about sexuality and aggression got toned down. Freud's tragic view of human nature gave way to therapeutic optimism. The couch became a path to better adjustment rather than uncomfortable self-knowledge. European analysts looked on with horror at what they considered American superficiality. Meanwhile, in France, Jacques Lacan was detonating his own theoretical bomb. A return to Freud, he declared, though his Freud was filtered through structural linguistics and would have been entirely unrecognizable to the man himself. Lacan's seminars in Paris became legendary, theatrical performances where he'd riff on dreams, mathematics, and philosophy, sending audiences into raptures or confusion, sometimes both. The scientific community was less impressed. By the 1960s, serious empirical research was finding psychoanalysis's claims difficult or impossible to test. How do you prove the existence of the Oedipus Complex? How do you measure successful dream interpretation? The philosopher Karl Popper used psychoanalysis as his prime example of an unfalsifiable theory. It could explain anything, which meant it explained nothing. Feminists launched their own assault. Kate Millett and others pointed out that Freud's theories essentially pathologized women for not being men. Penis envy, female masochism, women's weaker superegos, the entire framework seemed designed to justify male dominance. Even hysteria, the condition that launched psychoanalysis, was a gendered diagnosis applied almost exclusively to women whose symptoms were really responses to patriarchal oppression. The 1980s and 90s brought the recovered memory controversy, where therapists using Freudian influence techniques helped patients recover repressed memories of childhood abuse. Except many of these memories turned out to be false, implanted by suggestive questioning. The scandal damaged psychoanalysis's credibility and raised uncomfortable questions about how much therapists' theories shaped what patients discovered about themselves. Neuroscience delivered another blow. Brain imaging and neurochemistry were revealing the biological bases of mental illness, and they looked nothing like Freud's hydraulic model of psychic energy or his structural theory of id, ego, and superego. Depression responded to SSRIs, not working through Oedipal conflicts. Anxiety involved specific brain circuits, not defense mechanisms against repressed wishes. Yet, psychoanalysis refused to die. Some practitioners tried integrating it with neuroscience, arguing that Freud's unconscious mapped onto modern understanding of implicit memory and automatic processing. Others abandoned his specific theories while keeping the method, the therapeutic relationship, the attention to resistance and transference, the search for patterns in how people relate. Perhaps most surprisingly, Freud's cultural influence kept growing even as his clinical influence waned. Literary critics used psychoanalytic interpretation to decode texts. Historians applied it to biographical analysis. Film theorists found it perfect for analyzing cinema's dreamlike qualities. The ideas that didn't work in the clinic thrived in the humanities. By the 21st century, Freud had become less a scientist than a cultural figure, like Marx or Darwin, someone whose ideas had fundamentally changed how we think, even when we disagree with specifics. The notion that we have unconscious motivations, that childhood experiences shape adult personality, that we use defense mechanisms, that dreams might mean something. These had become common sense in Western culture, so embedded we barely notice their origin. The arguments continued. Every few years, someone would write a book, either defending Freud as a misunderstood genius or attacking him as a fraud. His supporters pointed to his influence on art, literature, and how we talk about ourselves. His detractors countered that popularity doesn't equal truth. Marx influenced billions, but that didn't prove his economic theories correct. The man himself had predicted something like this. "The voice of the intellect is a soft one," he wrote in The Future of an Illusion, "but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing." He'd spent his life trying to be heard, never fully succeeding in convincing the medical establishment or the wider culture. A half-century after his death, everyone had heard of Freud. Whether anyone actually believed him was another question entirely. Chapter 12. Freud Goes Pop. The 1960s did something unexpected to Freud. They made him cool. The counterculture, rebelling against 1950s conformity, discovered in psychoanalysis a language for discussing repression, liberation, and the conflict between individual desire and social constraint. Herbert Marcuse's Eros and Civilization reread Freud as a revolutionary, arguing that modern society created unnecessary surplus repression. Suddenly, the return of the repressed wasn't just a clinical term, it was a battle cry. Woody Allen's films turned psychoanalysis into comedy gold. Annie Hall, Manhattan, and countless others featured neurotic New Yorkers obsessed with their analysts, making therapy sessions a punchline. The joke was always affectionate, though. These characters might be ridiculous, but their self-examination was also somehow noble. Allen's New York was a city where everyone was in analysis, and being neurotic was more interesting than being well-adjusted. The couch became an icon. Magazine cartoons endlessly depicted patients lying down while bearded analysts took notes. "Tell me about your mother" became a cliché. Freudian slips entered everyday vocabulary. Those moments when you accidentally say what you really mean. The terminology spread. Ego, id, defense mechanisms, projection. People who'd never read a word of Freud casually referenced Oedipal complexes at dinner parties. Popular psychology books mined Freudian concepts, usually while claiming to move beyond them. "I'm okay, you're okay," and the entire self-help industry both depended on and rejected Freud, keeping his emphasis on childhood and inner conflict, while ditching the tragic pessimism and sexual focus. America wanted therapeutic optimism, and if you squinted, you could find it in a very selective reading of Freud. Hollywood couldn't resist the drama of psychoanalysis. The Three Faces of Eve, Spellbound, which Hitchcock made with Salvador Dali designing dream sequences, Ordinary People. Film after film featured breakthrough moments on the couch, repressed memories surfacing, and cathartic releases of emotion. The reality of psychoanalysis, 4 sessions a week for years, talking about everyday frustrations, slow incremental insights, was too boring for cinema. Movies needed "now I remember what my father did" moments. By the 1980s, Freud's image appeared on everything from coffee mugs to t-shirts. His stern, bearded visage became a symbol of intellectual seriousness, even for people who had no idea what he actually said. He was shorthand for psychology, the unconscious, or just generic deepness. Advertisers used Freudian symbolism, sometimes knowingly, sometimes not, in commercials filled with suggestive imagery that would have made the actual Freud roll his eyes. The irony reached peak levels when cocaine, the substance of Freud's early career embarrassment, became a status drug in 1980s culture. Nobody remembered that Freud had promoted it medically. They just knew he was associated with Victorian excess meeting modern liberation, somehow. Academic psychology departments, meanwhile, had mostly abandoned Freud. Cognitive psychology and neuroscience dominated, with their emphasis on empirical research and testable hypotheses. But in literature departments, film studies, and cultural theory, Freud thrived. French theory brought Lacan's impenetrable reworking of Freud to American campuses, generating thousands of incomprehensible papers about desire, the other, and symbolic orders. Then came the internet, and Freud got memed. His quotes, real and fake, circulated on social media. Before you diagnose yourself with depression, make sure you're not just surrounded by assholes, attributed to Freud constantly, though he never said it. His face appeared in motivational posters, usually with ironic captions. The serious scientist had become a mascot for pop psychology. Dating culture discovered Freudian language. Everyone's ex had mommy issues or daddy issues. Attachment theory, which had real scientific backing but got mixed up with psychoanalysis in public consciousness, explained why you kept choosing the wrong partners. Freud would have recognized the patterns: repetition compulsion, searching for your parent in your partners, but would have been horrified by the oversimplification. By the 21st century, social media provided perfect laboratories for observing Freudian mechanisms. Projection filled Twitter arguments, people accusing others of exactly what they were doing themselves. Reaction formation had people vocally opposing things they secretly desired. Denial about everything from politics to personal failings played out in real time. The defense mechanisms Freud identified were on display 24/7, though nobody needed psychoanalysis to see them anymore. True crime podcasts rediscovered Freud through the back door. Discussions of what drove serial killers or cult leaders inevitably circled back to childhood trauma, parental relationships, and unconscious motivations. The specifics might not be Freudian, but the framework: look to the past to understand the present, assume people's stated reasons aren't the whole story, was pure Freud. The man who'd wanted to be taken seriously as a scientist had instead become a cultural touchstone, a reference point, a meme. His specific theories about penis envy or the death drive were mostly forgotten or rejected. But his broader impact, making it normal to talk about unconscious motivation, childhood influence, and hidden desires, had saturated Western culture so thoroughly it was invisible. Somewhere, one imagines, Freud's ghost is both gratified and irritated. He'd wanted to be remembered for his scientific contributions, not his quotability. He'd wanted psychoanalysis practiced rigorously, not reduced to pop psychology cliches. But fame has its own logic, indifferent to the wishes of even the most controlling thinker. The unconscious, it turns out, includes collective cultural unconscious. And once an idea enters it, no amount of conscious effort can control how it reproduces and mutates. Freud, of all people, should have predicted that. Chapter 13: The Science Wars. The 1990s brought psychoanalysis's most serious existential crisis: evidence-based medicine. Healthcare insurers began demanding proof that treatments worked, and worked meant measurable symptom reduction in controlled trials. Psychoanalysis, 4 times a week for years, costing tens of thousands of dollars, producing changes that were subtle and subjective, faced an impossible challenge: prove your worth or perish. The research was devastating. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, treated depression and anxiety in 12 to 16 sessions with measurable, replicable results. Medication worked faster than talk therapy. Even brief psychodynamic approaches outperformed traditional analysis. Insurance companies took note and stopped covering long-term psychoanalysis. Training institutes saw applications plummet. The profession faced extinction. Defenders fought back, arguing that analysis addressed deeper issues than symptom relief. It changed personality structure, improved relationships, fostered self-knowledge. But how do you measure personality change? How do you quantify self-knowledge? The scientific establishment wanted numbers, controls, replications. Psychoanalysis offered case studies, clinical insights, and arguments that human experience wasn't reducible to data points. Meanwhile, neuroscience was delivering blow after blow. Brain imaging showed depression involved specific neural circuits. Genetics revealed heritable components of anxiety and schizophrenia. Neurochemistry explained how medications altered mood. Freud's hydraulic model of psychic energy, his structural theory of id/ego/superego, his stages of psychosexual development, none corresponded to anything observable in actual brains. Some analysts tried reconciliation. Mark Solms and others argued that modern neuroscience actually vindicated Freud. The unconscious was real. Implicit memory, automatic processing. Dreams had functions. Memory consolidation, emotional regulation. Early experiences shaped development. Neuroplasticity, attachment research. They claimed Freud got the details wrong, but the broad strokes right. Critics weren't buying it. That's retrofitting, they argued, finding superficial similarities between Freudian concepts and modern findings, then claiming validation. The unconscious cognitive scientists' study has nothing to do with Freud's seething cauldron of repressed wishes. Attachment theory contradicts Freud's drive theory. Repression, the foundation of psychoanalysis, lacks solid empirical evidence. The false memory controversy hit hardest. In the 1980s-90s, therapists using recovered memory techniques helped thousands of patients remember childhood sexual abuse. Families were torn apart, people imprisoned based on these memories. Then, researchers demonstrated how easily false memories could be implanted through suggestive questioning. Many recovered memories were fantasy, not fact. This struck at psychoanalysis's core. If memories aren't reliable, if they can be created through the therapeutic process itself, how could analysts trust what patients told them? Freud had faced this problem a century earlier when he stopped believing all his patients' seduction stories. But the false memory research suggested the entire method might be contaminated, that analysts' theories shaped what patients discovered about themselves. Feminists intensified their critique. Carol Tavris and others pointed out that Freud's framework inherently pathologized women. Penis envy framed women's psychology as a response to lacking male anatomy. Female sexuality was mature only when reoriented from clitoral to vaginal orgasm, a distinction with no physiological basis. Even his revised theories about female development assumed male psychology was the norm, female psychology a deviation. The recovered memory movement had particularly harmed women, they noted. Mostly female patients were encouraged to remember abuse, often by their fathers or other male relatives, creating a modern witch hunt that ironically reinforced the idea that women's memories couldn't be trusted. Psychoanalysis, supposedly liberating, became another tool for gaslighting women about their own experiences. Yet, paradoxically, psychoanalysis thrived in certain academic circles. Literary theory, film studies, and cultural criticism continued using Freudian and especially Lacanian concepts. Scholars analyzed texts, movies, and social phenomena through psychoanalytic lenses, often with brilliant results. The theory that didn't work clinically proved invaluable for interpretation. This split created a bizarre situation. Clinical psychology had largely abandoned Freud. Medical schools barely mentioned him except historically. But humanities departments taught his ideas as crucial intellectual tools. Freud was simultaneously discredited science and essential cultural theory, dead in the lab, alive in the seminar room. The crisis forced practitioners to evolve. Most therapists became integrative, borrowing from psychoanalytic, cognitive behavioral, humanistic, and systemic approaches. Pure classical analysis became rare, a boutique service for intellectuals and the wealthy. Short-term psychodynamic therapy emerged, applying analytic insights in briefer formats. The couch largely disappeared, replaced by face-to-face sessions. By the 2000s, a consensus emerged. Freud was historically important, but scientifically superseded. His specific theories, Oedipus Complex, psychosexual stages, drive theory, lacked empirical support. But his broader contributions remained valuable. The therapeutic relationship matters. Childhood experiences influence adults. People aren't fully aware of their motivations. We use psychological defenses against painful truths. It was a qualified legacy. Freud had been right that there was an unconscious mind, wrong about how it worked. Right that talking helps, wrong that his particular approach was uniquely curative. Right that sexuality matters in development, wrong about pretty much every specific claim regarding it. Right that we rationalize our behavior, wrong that everything traced back to repressed wishes. The science wars left psychoanalysis diminished but not destroyed. Training institutes still existed, analysts still practiced, patients still benefited. But the grand ambition, that psychoanalysis would be psychology's foundation, that Freud's theories would unlock human nature, that was dead. Buried under decades of research showing that minds were more complicated, simpler, and different than he'd imagined. The man who'd wanted to bring scientific rigor to psychology had created a system that ultimately couldn't meet science's standards. It was, in its way, the most Freudian irony of all. Chapter 14. The Ghost in the Cultural Machine. For all his scientific failures, Freud left fingerprints everywhere on modern Western culture. Walk through contemporary life and you can't escape his influence, even when people have never heard his name or actively reject his theories. He changed not just how we think about minds, but how we think about thinking itself. Consider the concept of the Freudian slip, those moments when you accidentally reveal what you really think. Before Freud, these were just mistakes. After Freud, they became windows into hidden truths. Now, when politicians accidentally say something revealing, comedians call it out. That was quite a Freudian slip. The idea that mistakes aren't random but meaningful has become common sense. Or take therapy itself. The notion that talking about problems to a trained professional might help, this barely existed before Freud. Earlier psychiatry was mostly asylums and physical treatments. Freud didn't invent talk therapy, but he made it respectable and central. Now, millions seek therapists when struggling, assuming that articulating feelings to someone who listens helps. That assumption, however, validated by later research, traces back to psychoanalysis. The emphasis on childhood in understanding adults is pure Freud. Before him, psychology mostly ignored early life. After him, every biography, every profile of a criminal or genius inevitably asks, what was their childhood like? We assume childhood experiences fundamentally shape who we become. That's Freudian thinking, so embedded we don't notice it. Even how we talk about ourselves changed. I'm in denial. He's projecting. That's your ego talking. She's got issues with her father. Classic Oedipal situation. These phrases permeate everyday conversation. People use defense mechanism terminology, rationalization, sublimation, displacement, without knowing they're quoting Freudian concepts. The vocabulary leaked from clinical theory into ordinary language. Popular culture absorbed psychoanalysis wholesale. Every TV drama features characters working through their trauma, usually through conversations with therapists that hit breakthrough moments suspiciously like psychoanalytic catharsis. Crime shows explain killers through childhood abuse and parental relationships. Romance plots revolve around characters repeating patterns from their parents' relationships. This narrative framework, present problems explained by past experiences, is Freudian to its core. Advertising discovered Freud early and never let go. Madison Avenue's hidden persuaders explicitly used psychoanalytic concepts to manipulate consumers. Products weren't sold on features, but on unconscious desires they supposedly fulfilled. Cars became sexual symbols. Cigarettes promised masculine power or feminine sophistication. Every ad campaign asked, what unconscious wish can we exploit? Freud would have been appalled, but his insights proved too useful for capitalism to ignore. The sexual revolution of the 1960s-70s invoked Freud selectively. Activists cited his insights about repression causing neurosis to argue for sexual liberation. They conveniently ignored that Freud believed some repression was necessary for civilization. His complex, tragic view of human sexuality, that we're torn between desire and social demands, that satisfaction brings its own discontents, got simplified into repression is bad, liberation is good. Academia's relationship with Freud became bizarrely bifurcated. Psychology departments treated him as a historical curiosity, but English, comparative literature, film studies, art history, and cultural theory departments made him foundational. Students might never encounter Freud in their psychology classes, but read him extensively in their literature seminars. The man who wanted to be a scientist ended up mattering most to humanities scholars. This created odd situations. A film student could write brilliantly about a movie's Oedipal themes using Lacanian psychoanalytic theory, but if they actually went to therapy for anxiety, their therapist would use CBT, not psychoanalysis. Freud was intellectually alive in interpretation, but clinically dead in treatment. The theories that didn't cure people proved invaluable for understanding cultural productions. Even his critics couldn't escape him. Feminist theory spent decades dismantling Freudian concepts, but also developed using his frameworks. Judith Butler's gender theory builds on and against Freud. Post-colonial criticism uses psychoanalytic concepts to analyze colonial relationships. You can't demolish a building without acknowledging its structure. Freud built structures that even his opponents inhabit. The self-help industry is essentially debased Freud mixed with cognitive psychology and positive thinking. The emphasis on childhood wounds, the search for root causes, the belief that understanding yourself brings change, these are psychoanalytic assumptions repackaged for mass consumption. That inner child people talk about healing, that's Freud's ideas about childhood development turned into something he'd barely recognize, but definitely originated. Perhaps most remarkably, Freud changed what it means to be an individual in Western culture. Before him, people were largely defined by their social roles and conscious beliefs. After him, we assume everyone has hidden depths, unconscious motivations, and inner conflicts. The modern Western self, psychologically complex, potentially self-deceived, requiring excavation to understand, is partially Freud's creation. This manifests in everything from how we date, looking for emotional availability, discussing commitment issues, to how we work, talking about imposter syndrome, recognizing workplace dysfunction. The very idea that we should examine our feelings, understand our motivations, and work on ourselves psychologically. This is the water we swim in, so familiar we don't notice it's there. The irony compounds when you realize Freud's pessimism got discarded while his methods survived. He believed humans were fundamentally conflicted, that civilization required repression, causing discontent, that perfect happiness was impossible. Western culture kept the therapeutic tools while embracing the opposite philosophy, that we can and should optimize ourselves for happiness. We use Freudian techniques to pursue anti-Freudian goals. Social media has created petri dishes for observing psychoanalytic mechanisms. Projection fills online arguments, people attacking in others what they can't acknowledge in themselves. Reaction formation has crusaders against vice secretly indulging in it. Narcissistic wounding drives outrage spirals. The ego defense mechanisms Freud cataloged play out publicly, constantly, though nobody credits him anymore. The vocabulary of mental health, itself a concept that took Freudian ideas about psychological well-being into mainstream medicine, is saturated with his influence. Toxic relationships, gaslighting, boundaries, trauma-informed. While these terms came from various sources, they reflect assumptions Freud helped establish: that psychological harm is real, that it often comes from relationships, that we can identify and address it. Even resistance to therapy uses Freudian logic. "I don't need therapy, I'm fine," is often interpreted as denial, a defense mechanism. The framework is so embedded that refusing to engage with it gets interpreted through it. You can't opt out of psychoanalytic culture. Even opting out becomes analyzable. The man who wanted to map the unconscious ended up reshaping consciousness itself. How we think about thinking, talk about feeling, understand ourselves and others. His specific scientific claims mostly failed, but his broader cultural impact succeeded beyond anything he imagined. Freud lost the battle for scientific credibility and won the war for cultural influence. In the end, perhaps that's fitting. Freud always argued that conscious intentions mean less than unconscious effects. He wanted to be remembered as a rigorous scientist. Instead, he became something more pervasive and less definable, a ghost in the cultural machine, invisible but everywhere, shaping how millions of people understand what it means to have a mind. Chapter 15: Freud in the Age of Brain Scans and AI. If Freud could materialize in the early 21st century, perhaps summoned by the collective anxiety of a therapy-obsessed generation, or the glow of fMRI machines mapping neural activity, he'd find both vindication and bewilderment. The world has moved past psychoanalysis while simultaneously becoming more Freudian than ever, a contradiction he, of all people, would appreciate. The neuroscience revolution promised to replace Freud's speculations with hard data. Brain scans reveal depression's neural signatures. Genetics explain vulnerability to anxiety. Neurochemistry shows how trauma physically alters the brain. The unconscious isn't a seething cauldron of repressed wishes, but automatic processing happening in evolutionarily older brain regions. Everything Freud theorized about is being explained in entirely different terms. Yet the new findings keep bumping into Freudian insights. Implicit memory research shows we're influenced by experiences we don't consciously recall. Not quite repression, but not entirely different either. Neuroscience confirms that childhood experiences wire the developing brain in ways that persist into adulthood. Attachment research demonstrates that early relationships create templates for later ones. The specifics differ from Freud's theories, but the broad patterns he identified keep reappearing. The therapy world has split into camps that would bewilder him. On one side, evidence-based treatments, CBT, DBT, EMDR, that focus on symptoms, thoughts, and behaviors, showing measurable results in controlled trials. On the other, a renaissance of psychodynamic approaches that incorporate neuroscience while maintaining focus on relationships, unconscious patterns, and the therapeutic alliance. Freud's couch mostly disappeared, but his method adapted and survived. Modern diagnoses have replaced Victorian hysteria, but the underlying patterns persist. Instead of paralysis and seizures, we have chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and functional neurological disorders, medically unexplained symptoms that look suspiciously like physical expressions of psychological distress. Instead of nervous breakdowns, we have burnout, anxiety disorders, and trauma responses. The language changed, the human suffering didn't. Social media has become an unprecedented window into unconscious processes. People publicly demonstrate defense mechanisms Freud described: projection, displacement, reaction formation, unaware they're following predictable patterns. Cancel culture involves moral outrage that sometimes masks similar impulses in accusers. Online personas split conscious presentation from unconscious drives in ways Freud would find fascinating and concerning. The explosion of trauma discourse reflects both Freudian influence and rejection of Freud. He recognized that psychological wounds have lasting effects, but abandoned his seduction theory, controversially suggesting some memories were fantasies. Modern trauma therapy takes trauma seriously in ways he didn't, yet uses concepts he developed: dissociation, repression, the compulsion to repeat. We've moved past Freud while building on his foundations. Artificial intelligence presents questions Freud never imagined, but his framework helps analyze. If AI systems develop that seem conscious, will they have an unconscious? Could machine learning algorithms that parse vast data to find hidden patterns be doing something like unconscious processing? The psychoanalytic concept of the other, the external perspective that shapes our self-understanding, gets weird when the other might be an algorithm. Therapy apps and AI chatbots now offer psychological support, democratizing access but raising Freudian questions. Can a non-human entity provide the therapeutic relationship that psychoanalysis argues is essential? Or was Freud wrong that the relationship itself heals? Maybe it's just the structured reflection. Early evidence suggests some AI therapy works, which either disproves psychoanalysis or proves Freud was right that patients do most of the work themselves. The pharmaceutical revolution both vindicated and challenged Freud. SSRIs can lift depression without analyzing dreams or excavating childhood memories, proof that mental states are biological. Yet medication alone often isn't enough. Therapy combined with meds works better than either alone. The talking cure didn't replace biology, but biology didn't replace talking either. The synthesis Freud never imagined, neuroscience plus psychology, seems to work best. Modern sexuality scrambles Freudian categories. Gender fluidity and trans identity don't fit his binary assumptions about male/female development. Asexuality challenges his claim that sexuality drives everything. Polyamory questions the centrality of monogamous Oedipal triangles. Yet even people rejecting his sexual theories use his vocabulary, talking about desire, repression, identity formation. His framework proved both wrong and indispensable. Climate anxiety presents a collective neurosis Freud couldn't have predicted. Millions know intellectually that catastrophe approaches, but continue behaviors causing it. A civilization-scale denial and repression. His concept of the death drive, that humans have self-destructive impulses, sounds uncomfortably relevant watching humanity accelerate toward environmental collapse despite knowing better. Our collective unconscious might be suicidal. The loneliness epidemic and connection crisis reflect what Freud called civilization and its discontents in new forms. Hyper-connected through technology, we're more isolated than ever. The psychic costs of modern life, anxiety, depression, alienation, aren't so different from the neuroses Freud observed in Vienna. We've replaced corsets and sexual repression with algorithms and performance anxiety, but the underlying tension between individual needs and social demands persists. Remarkably, psychoanalysis itself survives in unexpected forms. Psychodynamic therapy, shorter, more flexible versions of analysis, shows efficacy in research. Training as a psychoanalyst still requires being analyzed yourself, maintaining Freud's insight that therapists must understand their own unconscious. The full classical analysis on the couch 4 times weekly is rare, but the core method adapted and endures. Perhaps most surprisingly, there's growing recognition that different therapeutic approaches might work for different people through different mechanisms. The evidence-based medicine push to find the correct treatment is giving way to understanding that human psychological change is complex. Maybe CBT's conscious restructuring works for some. Maybe psychodynamic excavation of patterns works for others. Maybe both help through mechanisms neither theory fully captures. As society grapples with AI, climate change, social fragmentation, and questions about human nature that technology makes urgent, Freud's central questions remain relevant. Why do we do things that hurt us? How much can we truly know ourselves? What's the relationship between our conscious wishes and unconscious drives? Can understanding ourselves make us better, or is self-knowledge just another form of suffering? The answers have changed since Freud sat in his Vienna consulting room listening to patients talk about their dreams and desires. But the questions, those have aged remarkably well. The ghost of the bearded doctor still haunts our attempts to understand the strangest phenomenon in the universe. The human mind turning its gaze upon itself and finding, always, more mysteries than answers. Epilogue: The Spectre That Still Dreams. And that's the story of Sigmund Freud, the man who convinced the world we don't really know ourselves, and spent his life trying to map the unmappable territories of the human mind. Before you drift off to sleep, let's retrace his extraordinary journey through the unconscious of history. We began in Freiburg, where a restless boy with penetrating eyes grew up between Jewish traditions and Viennese ambitions. That young Freud, brilliant, driven, and convinced of his own significance, would become the revolutionary who explored everything from eel gonads to cocaine before finding his true calling in the mysteries of the mind. Then came the patients, hysterical women with inexplicable symptoms that conventional medicine dismissed. Freud listened, really listened, and discovered something remarkable. Their bodies were speaking what their mouths couldn't say. The talking cure was born, and with it the radical idea that psychological suffering had psychological causes. Ah, the dreams. That night at the Bellevue restaurant, when the Irma dream revealed its secret, Freud glimpsed the royal road to the unconscious. Picture him there, scribbling notes by gaslight, dissecting his own psyche with ruthless honesty, mapping a territory no one had properly explored before. The interpretation of dreams would change everything, though almost nobody noticed at first. The theories that followed made him infamous. The Oedipus Complex, infantile sexuality, the death drive, ideas that scandalized Victorian Vienna and continue making people uncomfortable today. The Wednesday Night Society became his intellectual laboratory, though the fights and schisms proved that even psychoanalysts couldn't escape the neuroses they studied. World wars bracketed his later life. The first shattered his optimism. The second forced him into exile. Through it all, cancer consumed his jaw while he consumed cigars. The ultimate demonstration that understanding your self-destructive impulses doesn't free you from them. In London, far from his beloved Vienna, he died as he'd lived, on his own terms, orchestrating even his final exit. After his death, the arguments exploded. Was he a genius or a fraud? Scientist or storyteller? His clinical theories crumbled under empirical scrutiny, yet his cultural influence kept growing. The vocabulary he created, ego, defense mechanisms, Freudian slips, seeped into everyday language. The assumptions he normalized, that childhood matters, that we have hidden motives, that talking helps, became foundational to how we think about ourselves. So, why does Freud matter tonight? Because whether you're drifting off after a therapy session or just wondering why you keep making the same mistakes in relationships, his central insight remains. We contain multitudes, and most of them we never consciously meet. The reasons we tell ourselves we do things are often not the real reasons. And sometimes the most important conversations are the ones we have with ourselves, in the dark, when nobody's watching. Now, as the candle of consciousness flickers low, let's leave Freud where we found him, in that artifact-filled study at Berggasse 19, listening intently as another patient speaks, searching always for the hidden meanings beneath the surface. The rest, dear listener, is up to your unconscious to decide. If these journeys into history help you unwind, do us a kindness. Tap that like button, whisper, subscribe, and leave a comment below. What stays with you about Freud's story? And who should we explore next? Now close your eyes. Let these ideas drift into wherever dreams come from, and we'll meet again soon for another story. Sleep well, and remember, sometimes a bedtime biography is just a bedtime biography, but sometimes